So why doesn't natural selection then get us perfect organisms? So why isn't there a perfect, squirrel or something like that? Why are squirrels still so various in their shapes and sizes and behaviors? So let's take a look at first some of the finches from the Galapagos. So here are some finches from the Galapagos. Now, when you look at these pictures, you might think, hey, those are two different species that we saw earlier in another lecture. But the thing is that this is actually the same species, right? These two birds are the same species of finch from one of the Galapagos Islands. What's happened is, you can see on the graph here, they actually tracked these birds through time and measured the average beak size. And so the pictures you're seeing are the average beak sizes at these two different points in time. So at this point in time and at this point in time. All right. And you can see they labeled these peaks right here for the average beak size. So when the beak sizes were largest, those coincided with droughts on that island. And then where we've got this beak size, this low beak size, is a year that was very wet, unusually wet, as you can see, on the island. All right. Now, why does this have anything to do with beak size? Why do we care about the drought or if it was wet? Well, that has to do with what kinds of seeds were available on the island at the time. So in dry years, only things that are really available are large, hard seeds. And in wet years, most of the plants that are producing seeds are small and soft. And so what happens is, in those dry years, more of the birds that have those bigger beaks were selected for. They survived and reproduced. And then in the wet years, more of the birds with the smaller beaks were selected for because those are best for eating those small soft seeds. All right? So this is why we don't end up with perfect organisms, because environments on this planet change incredibly quickly. They can change from year to year. They can change from season to season. And so organisms have to be able to adapt, and populations have to be able to change. Also, as we saw in an earlier video on mutation, variation is needed as the raw material for selection. So we need that variation to show up in the population in order for those populations to be able to change. So we can't have a whole bunch of the same organism running around because then there would be no ability to change if something happened. And then the last thing is that there may be multiple different genes or traits that get an individual the same fitness, right? So if we think, for example, of like bunnies, right? So that example of the rabbits with speed, right? But yeah, there are different speeds, so you can have really fast rabbits and slower rabbits. But that's not the only way you can hide from the fox or get away from the fox, right? So another option is you can be good at camouflage. So you can be a rabbit that's really good at hiding. And that is another trait that could get you the same fitness as being a really fast rabbit. So you could be a slower rabbit, but be really good at hiding and still be able to survive and reproduce at the same level as those really fast rabbits. So there's lots of ways that you can get that fitness, and that's part of why we also are not going to get that perfection, right? Because there's different ways that you can get to the fitness part of the organism. All right, the next thing I just want to talk briefly about, we'll talk more about this in our review, is artificial selection. So artificial selection is a special case of natural selection. So natural selection occurs because of, quote, pressures from nature, right? So food availability, temperature, predators, whatever it might be, that are changing those characteristics in the population. Artificial selection is directed by humans. So we are choosing the organisms that we want from the population to go forward. So, for example, corn. So this is our modern corn, right? Big ears. We have field corn and then sweet corn. This over here, this is teosinte. So there's the name for it. This is the plant teosinte. You can see it's bushy, lots of tiny little ears all over it. And these are the ears. Not a lot of kernels, and these kernels are hard. Teosinte, in order to be used, has to be ground. So you have to pound, let it dry out the rest of the way, and pound it and grind it into basically corn flour. Versus our big juicy ears. This is our modern corn plant. You can see one stalk, 1 to 2 years on the plant. So we have selected for things on this plant. So I want you to think about and answer how we went from this little tiny ear on teosinte to something big like this modern corn ear. And it's not just corn that we've done this with. We've done this with other plants. So this is wild mustard. Wild mustard grows around water areas in England, but we have done the same sort of process where we pick plants that have characteristics. So like with corn, we pick the ones that have the largest number of kernels over and over and over again until we end up with our modern corn. Well, here we took a wild mustard plant and picked the wild mustard plant that had the biggest leaves and did that over and over and over until you get kale. All 6 of these plants are the same plant. They've just been bred over time for these specific characteristics. So this one's just the stem, leaves. These are the buds where the sides of the plant come off. Again, you've got a bud type, which is related to the leaves. And then broccoli and cauliflower are both flowers. In fact, if you let broccoli go, it will actually flower. It will look like this, just with tons of flowers in the head. We don't just do this with plants. We've also done this with animals. So you may have caught this on an earlier slide. The runt of the pig litter is generally not kept because what do we want when we are raising pigs? We want big pigs because we're raising pigs generally for meat. And I know that sounds really sad, but if you've ever read Charlotte's Web, that's what Charlotte's Web was about at the beginning. And so the runt of the litter, which isn't necessarily this pig, but the runt of the litter is going to be killed because we don't want little pigs. And the runt is not going to generally do well, and it's not going to create a big pig. We've also done this with things like sheep. So when you think of sheep, this is probably what you think of, right? Big and poofy. And these are actually what the sheep are. This is what we bred those sheep from, right? Very short coats and these big horns, right? And that's because over time we decided we didn't want animals that could basically push us over. I mean, sheep can still do that, but then now they don't have the weaponry to, hurt us necessarily. And we picked the animals that had the thickest, longest fur that grew, right? These guys they shed their fur, but they don't grow big, thick, long coats of fur. Back in Darwin's time, and even still today, we also have been using artificial selection to breed these guys. So this is a rock pigeon. You may know it as a dove, but this is actually a pigeon. And you can see no feathers on the feet, very smooth coat, grays, a little bit of green up here. In Darwin's time, there were people who were called pigeon fanciers, basically people who bred pigeons as a hobby. People still do this today. You may have seen at the county fair, the state fair, we also do this with things like chickens and so forth. Well, here they are. Here are the pigeons. So you can see wide variety. These are all pigeons. So they all originally, way back when, looked like the one on the previous slide. But you can see bred with big feathers, feathers on their feet. This one's my favorite. It looks like a Vegas showgirl, if you've ever seen them with the big headdresses. These ones look like chickens. Obviously, these are not going to do well out in nature. But we've harnessed the power of selection, in this case, artificial selection. And then the last one is man's best friend that I want to show you. And we'll talk more about this one in our session as well.